Hi, friends. Pastor Jeff Dixon here. I thought we'd dig a little bit deeper in this episode by looking at the case for Christianity and the resurrection of Jesus Christ. One of the many important things that we know about the resurrection of Jesus Christ is how central and paramount it is to the Christian faith. And if a compelling case can be made for the resurrection of Jesus Christ, then certainly there is such a case that can be made for Christianity as a whole. And we're going to be exploring that today in this episode of Digging Deeper. The case for Christianity and the resurrection of Jesus Christ. So, exactly what are we going to be doing today? Well, we're going to move from the empty tomb to Christianity. And we're going to do so by looking at four specific areas. We're going to be looking at the resurrection of Jesus as history and looking at the evidence that there is for the resurrection of Jesus as history. We're going to be answering some of the objections that are lodged against that case. We're going to be then looking at a proposal for a theistic worldview, or why it is possible for us to conceive of our world as being one that includes God and supernaturalism, and that there is more than what we can observe scientifically or with our senses. And then finally, from there, we're going to be moving toward the person and teaching of Jesus and connecting the dots from, again, the resurrection to the major tenets of Christianity, or those who follow Jesus Christ. So this is how the argument is going to be organized. Again, starting with the resurrection, answering objections, moving toward a theistic worldview, and certainly on the very top shelf of that theistic worldview would be the person and teaching of Jesus Christ. So let's begin with the resurrection of Jesus as history. And we're going to be looking at and using the same tools that most historians use, regardless of what it is that they're studying or what event in the past they are looking at. And when it comes to past events, the historian's tools are typically as follows. They investigate and study written documents of an event, maybe a journal that was kept by a Civil War soldier, or maybe something is excavated from a tomb in Qumran that would illustrate something that took place in the ancient Near East, or whatever else. Many people write about things and have for millennia, and historians look at those writings so as to understand what took place many years ago. And we're not going to do anything different than that as part of our study today. They're going to also, when they look at written documents, they're going to pay special attention to eyewitness testimony if there is any available. Eyewitness testimony gets us as close to the original action as possible, and so they figure prominently among the tools that historians will use. They'll also look at relevant archaeological finds to see whether or not things or events can be verified that are reported in the documents that have been excavated in the eyewitness testimony that has been revealed. So this is the list of tools that historians use, and when those things are exhausted, then they will look at literary criticism or studying what has been written about the events that they are looking at to see whether or not there are legitimate reasons to believe that what has been written is in fact true. So these are some of the tools that historians use, some of the major ones that we're going to be using when we look at the resurrection of Jesus as history. And you might say, well, this is far-fetched, or this is not the same thing. Well, what do we have? We have a claim, and it just so happens that this claim happens to be found in Scripture. And the claim is that Jesus of Nazareth died by means of crucifixion and rose again 3 days later. And we're going to study that claim using the same tools that historians will study any claim, whether it be that George Washington was our first president, or that Martin Luther sparked the Reformation, or at least was one of the people that sparked the Reformation, or that Constantine legalized Christianity in Rome, or whatever other historical claim that you would want to verify. We're going to verify the resurrection in the very same way. It might be the greatest claim ever given, but it is a claim nonetheless that we can provide good reasons for using the tools that historians will use. The historian's rules. So in addition to the tools that historians have, historians abide by certain rules that we're going to try to abide by as well as we make our case for the resurrection of Jesus as history. And some of the rules include the seeking of eyewitness sources. Again, they prioritize eyewitness testimony. We're going to look for what's early. We're not going to, in other words, put the majority of the weight of our argument on things that we find that are much later than the events that they report on. It's better to find sources that are reporting this soon after the events take place, and the earlier a report is, or the earlier a source is, the more weight it's going to hold. We're also going to look not just for one source or two, but multiple sources. Just as if you're writing a research paper and you're hoping that the reader believes your argument, you're going to want to reference extensively and find support from reputable academic or scholarly sources that either agree with what you're saying or agree with the parts of your argument that lead to your conclusion. The same is true with anything that we find in history. The more sources you have that are saying the same thing, the more legitimate your claim may be. And we're also going to not just look for multiple sources, but for multiple sources for multiple different forms. We have examples of this in the Bible. We have accounts of the resurrection reported in Gospels, in history books like the book of Acts, in letters like in the epistles of Paul. We also have it from extra-biblical sources, historians like Josephus and Tacitus saying things that look eerily similar to what we read about in the gospel accounts, particularly as it pertains to the resurrection and the fallout that occurs thereafter. So multiple forms provide good evidence for what historians study. We're also going to find or look for, as historians look for, discontinuity or dissimilarity. If every account of a historic event is exactly the same, even though it comes from multiple places and multiple sources, we're going to wonder whether or not they conspire to share the same story in exactly the same way. It's actually to our benefit to see slight differences in style and differences in detail when we look at these stories. Now, we don't want them to be inconsistent on the major things that they're reporting on, but if they illustrate different details or highlight different aspects of the story, that actually works in our favor, because just as if you got three people in a room and asked them to report on the same concert that they viewed the previous evening, you're probably going to get the same general story, hitting the major highlights of the concert and maybe who was singing or who was playing in the concert, but you're going to also learn different things. You're going to hear that the reports are slightly different and dissimilar. Does that mean that the concert was any less legitimate or that it didn't happen? No, but it actually works in our favor to see the same event from multiple perspectives. And what's even better than it being dissimilar is embarrassing. If there are embarrassing details, those tend to legitimize a historical account as well. Because if you're making something up, you're going to want to make yourself look good. But if you're trying to be truthful, you're probably going to reveal some embarrassing details also. And certainly we have that in the resurrection of Jesus Christ, as we will soon see, at least the accounts thereof. We're also going to want to see agreement among enemies. It's one thing to have those sympathetic to your cause sharing the same thing, but what of those who are not sympathetic to your cause? If they're saying the same thing, certainly that's even more compelling evidence. So let's go back to our Civil War analogy earlier that I briefly mentioned. If you have reports, if you find multiple reports of a battle, let's say, that took place in and around Virginia at the time of the Civil War, and you have so far found eyewitness sources, maybe a a soldier from the South uh, kept a journal, a diary, and reported on the events that took place. We have early accounts also from that, as he would be an early account if he's an eyewitness to it. But then we also have newspaper articles that were printed in and around that time saying the same thing that this rebel soldier was saying. And we have it not just in newspapers, but we have it from multiple soldiers from the South that are sharing the same details, obviously with different highlights and different styles. And so they're discontinuous and dissimilar on some level. And let's say that they're even willing to suggest that in this particular situation or hypothetical, that they lost this battle, so it's embarrassing. Well, what would be even better would be to have the same account or a verifying account from a Union soldier. So let's say we keep digging around this battlefield and we find a journal from a Union soldier that shares the same thing, the same outcome, same conclusion as all of the previous evidence from the rebel side or the side of the South. That's going to be compelling evidence because not only do you have one side saying this account happened or this happened, but the other side saying the very same thing. And of course, you're going to want all of this evidence to cohere. You're not going to want to find something that just goes totally off the deep end and saying something totally different. Going back to our Civil War analogy, if all of this evidence so far has said that one side won the battle, and then all of a sudden you find something that says the other side won the battle, that's a huge detail that needs to be consistent. And you would then question everything you've researched up to this point if all of a sudden you began finding things that said the outcome of the battle was totally different. So these are some of the historians' rules that they use when measuring evidence and providing a hierarchy of what evidence is best in order to legitimize or provide good reasons for believing that past acts occurred. And so when it comes to the Bible and the account therein of the resurrection of Jesus Christ, what are the historians' picks? What in the scriptures do they prioritize, especially in the New Testament, when it comes to the resurrection account? Well, it might surprise you to learn that when it comes to the biblical evidence of the resurrection, the historians like 1 Corinthians best. Why? Because very few, if any, people question the authorship of 1 Corinthians as being Paul. It's also written very early, so it's very closely connected to the events of the resurrection and the crucifixion. And for lots of other reasons, 1 Corinthians is high on the list of both critical and conservative New Testament scholars. Well, I say critical, I mean liberal and conservative critical New Testament scholars as being a very good source to go on. And it just so happens that in 1 Corinthians 15, one of the many things that Paul talks about is the resurrection. Galatians, for many of the same reasons as 1 Corinthians, is prioritized among historical scholars when it comes to the New Testament. 2 Corinthians, Romans, Philippians, 1 Thessalonians, and Philemon. Now notice, what do all these have in common? They're all Pauline. And historical scholars, critical scholars, love Paul because, again, his authorship is not in question in the same way, say, Hebrews is, or even 2 Peter, or other books of the Bible, the Gospels even. And again, there's a lot that Paul says in the epistles that you see listed here that can be verified historically. And so for these reasons, these are the picks the historians will go on when they prioritize the biblical evidence, not just for the resurrection, but for early Christianity. Now, in addition to these picks that historical scholars prioritize, you also have creedal statements. And this presents something of a problem for historians because the creedal statements predate even the Pauline literature. And what are we talking about when we talk about creedal statements? We're talking about formalized statements that were shared in the early worship of the early church, either in song or in congregational um, congregational statements that were made and shared in the worship context. We're talking about statements such as the one found in 1 Corinthians 15, 3 through 11, when it says, Christ died according to the Scriptures, and that he was buried, and that he rose again on the third day according to the Scriptures. In fact, when you read these creedal statements, another one is found in Romans 10, 9 and 10. If you believe with your heart, confess with your mouth that Jesus is Lord and God raised him from the dead, you will be saved. You hear this sing-songy rhythmic pattern to them that is indicative of something that would have been easy to memorize, easy for people to recite, especially corporately in a corporate worship setting, that were shared and used in the early church worship even before major books of the New Testament were even written. And these creedal statements are also sometimes introduced, especially here in 1 Corinthians. This particular one is introduced by, I gave you what I have been given, or I share with you now what we have shared with you before. And if they've shared it before, or if this statement was given to Paul, that means it predates even the writing of 1 Corinthians, which is already early, and why it's so prioritized among historical scholars. So where did Paul get this particular creed, and from whom? Well, it ends up being fairly early. If 1 Corinthians was written in 55 AD, which most scholars agree is a good date for the writing of Corinthians, we're just 25 years removed from the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ already. But we know that 2 or 3 years after Jesus' resurrection, Paul, who's formerly Saul, was on his way to Damascus as a church persecutor, and Jesus appears to him and he's converted, changes his name to Paul, and changes his ways from church persecutor to church planter. We then know that he spends a few years off studying, and then he interfaces with the disciples to check his theology and to check that what he is learning and studying and sharing and now using as he plants churches around Rome at this time is legitimate. And so when 1 Corinthians comes around and he says, I give to you what I have received earlier, we think that this pertains to this period of training with the disciples that he had in 35 AD, just 5 years removed from the death and resurrection. That's pretty early. These creeds would have even predated this 35 AD date, because we know that from the beginning of the church, which would have started at Pentecost, just days after Jesus resurrected from the grave, we would have had the disciples' testimony and the formalization of creeds like this that would have been shared in the early church to help supplement their worship and doctrine. And so when we say that these creeds are early, we're talking about as early as you possibly could get when it comes to evidence for these historical events. And what's amazing about these creeds is so many of them talk about or celebrate the resurrection of Jesus Christ, demonstrating that from the very beginning of the church, the resurrection was something that they took as fact and celebrated in their worship, just a few years removed from the event itself. So, how do we know what a creed is? How do we know when something really juicy and early like this is in the scriptures? Well, I delivered to you what I received often indicates the beginning of a creedal statement. Sometimes they are introduced in the New Testament as a trustworthy statement. It is a trustworthy statement, and then whatever follows is a creedal statement. Not always, but in a lot of cases. The stylized nature, the cadence that you hear, even in English, although it's more prominent in Greek, you hear this sort of rhythmic, stylized meter. If you know of Shakespeare, the iambic pentameter, you've got some kind of pentameter, or not pentameter, but you have some kind of meter here with these creedal statements. You also, at least in Pauline literature, you find non-Pauline terms. He's using words that he doesn't typically use, and if he's using words he doesn't typically use, it might be because they're from somewhere else, or from a statement that has its origin in another person or group, And when you find non-Pauline terms, sometimes you have an example of a creed, and then you have what's called the triple hati. Hati is a word in Greek. It's actually 3 letters instead of 4. We transliterate it as hati. It's how it's pronounced. But it's a conjunction that illustrates another phrase or another clause. That he was buried, and that, it actually is translated that most often, or because. And when you see 3 of them working together to join 3 phrases together or 4 phrases together, you might have a creedal statement. These units of doctrine that were organized in this way. And so there are many of them in the New Testament. Again, they're very early, and most of them celebrate the resurrection of Jesus Christ. Now, in addition to these very early accounts, Pauline accounts especially, you also have these creedal statements that are very early. And in addition to these, you have the facts, or the facts that are most widely accepted by the gamut of historical scholars, ranging from evangelical conservatives to liberal atheists and agnostics. And the majority of these scholars will concede the following facts concerning the events surrounding the resurrection of Jesus Christ. Here are the top 3. Very few, if any, historical scholars of repute, of good reputation, will deny the fact that Jesus was crucified. A man called Jesus from Nazareth died by means of crucifixion. In fact, Josephus and Tacitus, even early on in the 1st and 2nd century, are saying as much. They cannot deny the reports that a man named Jesus under Pontius Pilate, who was governor of this area, died by means of crucifixion. Now, why is that important? Well, that doesn't necessarily prove the resurrection, but it does prove, or at least works to prove, that Jesus was in fact dead. He really did die. People didn't survive crucifixions, all right? And those that carried them out, namely the Roman soldiers, were professionals at their job. They knew how to kill people. It's one thing they were very good at. And so we know, especially given the gospel accounts, that they confirmed Jesus was dead by means of crucifixion, with the spear that went into his side and the blood pouring forth with the water. So, very few, if any, people deny that Jesus of Nazareth in the 1st century, around AD 30 to 33, died by means of crucifixion. Secondly, most historical scholars will also concede, again, from a wide range of backgrounds and presuppositions and bias, that the disciples had experiences that they believed were appearances of the risen Jesus. Right? So they're not saying that it was the risen Jesus, but they will say that, nope, we do have a lot of reports from the disciples saying that they had what they believed were experiences of the risen Jesus. And most scholars will agree on that. The third most compelling evidence that historical scholars will concede is the testimony of Paul. How does someone go from a persecutor of the church to a church planter? Well, something like the resurrection of Jesus from the dead would certainly fit the bill as an explanation for how someone could undergo such a dramatic life change. And given what we know of Paul and how highly historical scholars revere Paul, very few question that he had a life-transforming experience and went from going one way to a completely different way in his life's trajectory. And so these are the top 3 facts that most scholars prioritize above all others. The next 3 that people are willing to concede is the willingness to die. We're talking about the disciples' willingness to die for what they believed in. And many of them, in fact, all but one, and even he suffered as a result, gave their lives for the gospel that they shared, which included the deity, the death, and the resurrection of Jesus Christ. Now, Most people who are willing to give their lives for cause are willing to do so because they are convinced of its truthfulness. Few, if any, people are willing to give their lives for what they know is a lie or what has been made up. And that is compelling evidence that the resurrection account is, in fact, a legitimate account. The disciples were willing to die. We know. History tells us how they died for their faith. And this is a stark contrast from what they were doing just weeks prior, hiding in a room behind a closed door, fearful and cowardly. They go from being cowards to heroes, at least for the cause of Christ, even willing to lay their lives down for what they believed was true. James, in his testimony, is another historical fact that is conceded among most critical scholarship. James, the brother of Jesus, was skeptical of Jesus' identity. In fact, we know from the scriptures that on several occasions he even was embarrassed by Jesus. But following the resurrection, James goes from being a doubtful skeptic to one of the early church leaders in Jerusalem. And this is verified by a lot of historical evidence. And third, we have early accounts. Most scholars agree that we have early accounts of the resurrection. Even in the Gospels, although they're not as high on the list of historical scholars as Paul's writings, we know Mark was written fairly early, according to historical standards, and even the other Gospels of Matthew and Luke, and even John, as late as his is not nearly as far removed from the events that he reports on as a lot of other accounts of other historical events that people accept as true without really any verification. We have multiple early accounts. When you take the creeds, you take Paul's letters, you take the Gospels, and probably in that order, of the resurrection. And there are multiple accounts, there are multiple forms. They include enemy attestation or reports that confirm the same thing. And they are also embarrassing accounts, including details like the cowardice of the disciples and the first responders and witnesses of this most important event being women, which would have not been what you would expect in the first century world. All of these accounts are very compelling evidences for this resurrection account. The next few involve the fact that the resurrection becomes the center of belief in this new and growing movement called Christianity in the first century. It is so central, in fact, that people begin worshiping on Sunday rather than Saturday, because we know that Christianity was born out of Judaism. Certainly, a lot of Jews denied the resurrection, but many believed in it and began worshiping on Sunday. We know that it also preoccupied the preaching content of the early church and among many Jewish people as well. And we know that as a result of the resurrection, people were willing to place Jesus in the Godhead and exalt and worship him as deity. And we also have the fact that Jesus predicted ahead of time his resurrection. Now, this isn't as widely held as some of these other facts we've looked at, kind of going in order of most accepted and conceded among the widest range of scholars to lesser concessions or things that are not conceded as quickly. But if you are going to believe in the gospel accounts, you do know that Jesus said ahead of time, I'm going to die, I'm going to rise again. I'm going to die, I'm going to rise again. He says it multiple times, which makes you wonder why the disciples questioned him at all to begin with, but he predicted it. And then we have perhaps the most controversial historical fact. We have the empty tomb. Now, this isn't as widely held among the critical scholarship, but we're going to pay special attention to it so that we have good reason to believe that this should be included among the facts that we have for the historical resurrection of Jesus Christ. So let's look at the empty tomb in particular and some of the arguments for this line of evidence. First, we have the female testimony. Women were the first responders to the empty tomb. We know the story. They go on the third day in the morning to treat the body of Jesus that is under guard from the Roman soldiers in a well-known rich man's tomb. And when they go, they discover that he's missing. The angel says, "Go and tell the disciples what you have seen," and they do so. Now, why is this good evidence for the empty tomb? Again, as I've already alluded to earlier, this is one of the many arguments of embarrassment. Women in the first century were not considered to be credible witnesses. And so the fact that women are the witnesses to the resurrection is good evidence to show that this is probably how it went down. Because if you're trying to make this up for people to believe it, if you're the disciples, and this is just something that you're hoping will sell your new and invented worldview, you're probably not going to have women as the first witnesses to this most pivotal event that you're hoping to give an argument for. And so this detail goes a long way in demonstrating that the tomb was in fact empty, and if it's being made up, certainly you wouldn't have women as the first responders. Secondly, the birth of Christianity in Jerusalem. This is compelling evidence. Why? Because if you were a citizen of Jerusalem and you're hearing this rumor that Jesus has raised from the dead, you could easily check that for yourself and verify, either through interviewing some people that you know were very close to Jesus or going and visiting the tomb itself to see whether or not there was any teeth to this story that's being spun. And the fact that Christianity is born in Jerusalem and grows first and out of Jerusalem suggests that there was nothing found that could easily debunk or throw shade on this account that's being circulated that Jesus, in fact, rose from the dead, demonstrating that perhaps the tomb was indeed empty that third day. Again, it's also reported by multiple different people, multiple different disciples. In fact, Jesus is even said to appear to 500 people at one time. We know that in the Gospels, but Paul also gives an account of that in 1 Corinthians 15. But not only that, in Matthew 28, 11 through 15, the Jews who had Jesus killed, or desired that to be the case, claim that the tomb is empty. Now they provide their own reason for the tomb being empty, their own verification for that, but the fact that they're even telling the people that the tomb is empty and the disciples stole the body suggests that the tomb was in fact empty on that third day. It's also found in the early creeds that we've already made mention of. Again, enemy attestation, I just mentioned that, Matthew 28, 11 through 15, and so on. So even this final fact of the empty tomb is widely conceded among the evidence here that it actually took place and should be included among the evidences given for the resurrection of Jesus as history. So we have a lot of evidence to go on. What kind of evidence? The kind of evidence that historians love and would drool over to have to verify past events in history. In fact, one Harvard law professor, Dr. Greenleaf, is quoted in saying that there is more evidence for the resurrection of Jesus Christ than for almost any other past event according to the law of legal evidence that's used in courts. I mean, you've got enough to go on. You've got plenty of compelling evidence to go on to, on good grounds, assume or at least believe that the same Jesus who died by means of crucifixion 3 days later was seen alive and the tomb was empty. So, the second thing I want to do, now that we've built this historical case for the resurrection, using the same kinds of evidences that historians for other things would use, we're going to respond to various skeptics concerning miracles in general and the resurrection in particular. Because as you know, this evidence doesn't convince everyone, and I'm sure that even some of you watching this might have your own responses to what you've heard so far. So let's deal with some of the more popular, widely known arguments against miracles in general and the resurrection in particular. But let's first define what a miracle is. A miracle is a dynamic, specialized event which nature is incapable of producing that temporarily supersedes or appears to supersede the normally observed known pattern of nature. Such an event is brought about by the power of God or another supernatural agent for the purpose of verifying or drawing attention to a person or message. Now, that is a very robust definition. I didn't make it up myself. I had some help from Dr. Gary Habermas, where I think this definition comes from. So I want to make sure we reference him appropriately. But this is an important definition. And you can see just how carefully worded it is. It's a dynamic event. It's specialized. The normal mechanisms of nature are suspended or superseded. And it is said to have been brought about by the power of God or some other supernatural agent working from the outside in, and it exists for the purpose of drawing unique attention to a person or a message. And that's a good definition of a miracle. So what are the objections to miracles, or that they're even possible or exist? Well, one objection is you don't have enough evidence for miracles. Well, at least according to when it pertains to the resurrection, it seems that we do. We have lots of evidence. And certainly, while the burden of proof might be on us to demonstrate it, there's plenty of good reasons to believe that something like the resurrection of Jesus Christ could have occurred. Now, it's not enough to convince everyone, but then again, what is? And the more evidence that we have, the higher the threshold is placed for people to believe it. The bigger the line is, the further down the road, or the greater the weight of the burden of proof becomes. It just becomes something that is almost unreachable for some people to ever believe that there's enough evidence to believe in the resurrection. But we do have enough evidence to hold to a resurrection view on good grounds. We do have enough. It may not be enough for you, but we certainly have enough to believe in the resurrection with good reason. Another objection is the accommodating nature of miracles. You cannot, maybe there's another explanation. And certainly this might work for other things, such as the calming of the sea. That's a miracle in the gospel accounts. Well, maybe the low pressure system just dissipated. That happens. Storms come as quickly as they go in some cases. And certainly that is one explanation that might be proffered for something like the calming of the Sea of Galilee when Jesus calms the storm. And it's coincidence that when he said it, the low pressure system just dissipated. Well, certainly, there are other miracles that this could work for, other explanations, biological, meteorological, or whatever else that might be used to explain away what the Bible says, but you don't seem to be able to accommodate for dead men coming back to life. There just doesn't seem to be biological precedent for that kind of thing happening, especially when he's been dead for 3 days or 2 nights, but still 3 days. I mean, there's no biological or compelling explanation for something like that. And so that objection seems to be relatively easily refuted. Thirdly, miracles don't come with labels on them made by God. Certainly, unexplainable things happen, but you're just putting a God label on it. Well, certainly that might be the case for some people when they're trying to explain different things that happen in their lives. But in the resurrection, Jesus predicts his death and resurrection time and time and time again. And then it happens, confirming that, at least in this case, this particular miracle seems to have been wrought by God. And then you have the whole controversy surrounding the Shroud of Turin. We might have a label. We might have a photograph of this. Now, it's debated whether or not there's legitimacy to the shroud, and that's a whole other discussion for a whole other presentation. But at least it's possible that we have we have photographic evidence on this shroud that something miraculous took place all those years ago. So Jesus predicts it, and it happens. That's as good as a made by God label as we can get. And certainly, while this objection might be more easily lodged on other miracles, the resurrection seems to be a unique case where this objection doesn't work. Then we have a fourth objection that we're going to look at. And this is the case by Hume that has been popularized and used in different ways. And Hume's argument goes like this. A miracle is by definition a rare occurrence, and we would agree with that, right? Miracles don't happen all the time. In fact, if they did, they would cease to be miracles. Natural laws, by definition, a description of regular occurrence. We would tend to agree with that as well, right? I mean, natural law is law because it's the regular order of things. The evidence for the regular is always greater than that for the rare. Okay? A wise man always bases his belief on the greater evidence. Therefore, he says, a wise man should never believe in miracles. So that's his argument. Miracles are rare. Natural law describes what normally happens. There's always more evidence for what normally happens than what's really rare. And so if you're trying to be wise, you're going to side with what's more natural, and therefore you should throw miracles out. So how might we respond to David Hume? Or what are some problems with this argument? Well, Hume here assumes uniform experience in all cases. Natural law certainly is regular, but it's not always normative. And we have plenty of examples of this. I'm not sure that miracles are as rare as David Hume makes them, because we have accounts upon accounts upon accounts of multiple miracles having occurred in the world. And uniform experience may not be as uniform as David Hume wants it to be. Hume also tends to add evidence instead of weigh evidence. Certainly, while what's normative and regular is going to have more evidence for it because it is more common, it doesn't mean that there could be, in special cases like the resurrection of Jesus Christ, overwhelming good evidence that in this moment those natural laws were suspended. And we've already listed those historical evidences for you, and in that case it seems that the good evidence outweighs the normative evidence. Hume cannot use evidence from the past to determine the present. Just because something has always worked or has tended to work in a certain way over a long period of time doesn't mean it's always going to do that. Science itself is not prepared to tell us what's going to happen in the future, and nor can it explain that things that are happening now have always happened like that in the past. Many modern physicists hold that nature's laws are statistical, describing what generally occurs, but not what always occurs or absolutely always occurs, and that's important. So, another way we could look at these objections is by looking at the alternative naturalistic theories concerning the resurrection. If Christians believe that Jesus rose from the dead, and that is the best explanation for all the historical evidence that all of these historical scholars are willing to concede, what do people say is an alternative explanation for those who don't believe in the resurrection? In other words, how does someone who doesn't believe in the resurrection account for all of the evidence that we've looked at so far? Well, here are the alternative theories that some atheist or agnostic historical scholars offer for the resurrection of Jesus Christ. The first is called the swoon theory. And this believes that Jesus didn't really die, but was in a comatose state and woke from this 3 days later. Okay, that's one theory. But a response to that might be, well, the swoon theory doesn't engender the response that we witness in the disciples' lives of hope and excitement and victory. If Jesus comes back to wherever the disciples are hiding themselves up, half dead, and says, "Follow me," I'm not sure that the disciples would be willing to give their lives for that kind of hero, and yet they do. And he didn't survive crucifixion barely and slowly recover to give us the kind of movement that we have in the early parts of the first century. So swoon theory doesn't really bode well for what we see happening in the early church. The swoon theory also fails to appreciate the crucifixion in that the Romans knew what they were doing. Again, these were professional killers. They knew what they were doing. They saw to it well, and they confirmed their victims were dead before disposing of the bodies. Also, swoon theory does not adequately explain how the body got through a sealed tomb. How does a half-dead, comatose person roll a stone away and escape crawling all the way back to wherever the disciples were being held past Roman guards? It just doesn't make any sense. And so swoon theory, for these reasons, appears to be less than compelling. Another alternative theory for the resurrection, or in place of the resurrection, is the mass hallucination theory. And this theory believes that all who claim to experience a risen Christ suffered from a hallucination, and in some cases, a mass hallucination, such as in the account of Jesus appearing to 500 people at one time. They're all just having a psychotic moment at the same time. Well, hallucinations, according to most psychiatrists, are personal. In fact, there are very few, if any, compelling cases of mass hallucinations in history. But I guess maybe there's room for one, and this would be the one, right? But no, hallucinations tend to be personal and not shared. Also, the disciples were not ripe for hallucinations. We don't have any evidence that one or more of them was at risk of mental illness. We don't see that before or after the resurrection. We know that they were maybe depressed and despondent after watching Jesus die on the cross. Certainly they may have wanted him to be alive, but the conditions were not ripe for the kind of psychotic break that would be required for a hallucination to occur. And again, what about the body? If they're making it up or they're hallucinating this, where's the body? Again, the tomb appeared to be empty. We have good reason to believe the tomb was empty 3 days later. And do hallucinations change lives? At least in the way that we see them change the life change in the disciples? I don't think so. I mean, certainly hallucinations can change a person's life, but most of the time it's in a negative way, and it's a very sad situation. The disciples lead a successful and growing movement following this event, and it is totally cogent and consistent and appears to bring inspiration and hope in a consistent way to those that it touches and those who accept it. So again, not sure that hallucinations would change the lives in the way that we see in the disciples of the first century. And again, there's no clear evidence that any of them were suffering from the kind of mental illness that would bring about a hallucination, let alone a shared or group hallucination. Another alternative theory is legend. The resurrection story develops substantially away from the accounts of the original witnesses, usually over time, perhaps even borrowing from other ancient tales. This is just the latest iteration of a hero dying and coming back to life, and the Christian disciples put their own spin on, in other words. Well, we have early and consistent records, not just from the disciples, but also from extra-biblical literature and even enemies that can at least appear to concede that the resurrection account took place. We have eyewitness reports. We again have this willingness to die. People tend not to be willing to die for what they know is fake or just a made-up legend. And so for these reasons, we can answer these objections and demonstrate that each of these objections or alternative theories is less than compelling. So, now that we've made a case for the resurrection being historical, and now that we've answered some of the objections that are raised against this, let's connect the resurrection of Jesus to the Christian worldview and make this turn now to demonstrating how the resurrection can help us verify the Christian worldview, or the classical theistic worldview, first, and then the Christian worldview in particular. So where we come so far? There are many reasons to believe that a man named Jesus from Nazareth died on the cross and 3 days later was seen by multiple people by means of a resurrection. Naturalistic explanations like mass hallucination theory and swoon theory are less than compelling for what is historically documented, and the resurrection, given all the evidence, as an explanation for number one, appears to win against these alternative explanations. So that's where we've come so far. But where are we going? We're going to learn reasons why it is not only appropriate, but highly likely that we live in a theistic universe in which God does intervene and could bring about something like this resurrection that is reported in the Bible. So, let's build a case for a theistic worldview using some of the more common and well-known philosophical arguments. C.S. Lewis's argument was this: no thought is valid if it can be fully explained as the result of irrational causes. In other words, if irrational beginnings, like a Big Bang, cannot produce rational thought, yet we still know certain things, then our thinking must have a rational origin. It's a great argument that instead of random happenstance or chance being used in some way to explain the thought capacity that we have as human beings to reason and think deeply about things, it makes a lot more sense that our ability to reason and rationalize is found not in random chance, but in a rational origin, namely a rational creator in whose image we are created. Second, a cosmological argument. Whatever begins to exist has a cause. The universe began to exist, therefore the universe has a cause. Now, we can debate what that cause is, but typically, if you concede that a Big Bang caused it, the next question is, well, what caused the Big Bang? And there have been theories promoted for that or offered for that. It seems better to say that everything that is in existence has a cause except an uncaused cause, right? Causer, in other words, namely God himself. Otherwise, you're going to have this infinite regress of causes going ad nauseum into eternity past. It makes more sense to believe that the universe has a cause, and that cause is uncaused, an eternal being, namely, or perhaps God. And then the teleological argument suggests that there is a series of scientific arguments that, especially taken together, indicate that there is an orderly pattern, purpose, or information structure in nature as a whole, but particularly in human and other life forms. There's order, there's sophistication, there's design in the universe that we witness on both a macro and micro level that demonstrates things like irreducible complexity. Complexity that is better explained not by slow processes of evolution, but by instantaneous, sophisticated, thoughtful, well-designed creation. Things like the bacteria flagella, this most efficient of machines found on planet Earth that has all of these special pieces that could not work if one of them was missing, all having to exist simultaneously in order for this cell to move around in the way that it does. We have just the sophistication and language found in DNA. We have the fine-tuning of the universe and our proximity to things like the sun and other planets that allows us to have life on the earth in ways that is found nowhere else. And so all of these and many more demonstrate incredible design in the universe that would point to an ultimate designer. In addition to these philosophical arguments, we have evidential arguments, things like near-death experiences. Now, again, we're not necessarily reaching with these arguments, either philosophical or evidential, to the Christian God of the Bible. But what we're saying is there are reasons to believe that there's something beyond just the natural world out there, be it an uncaused cause, be it a designer, be it a rational mind, or be it some other life beyond this one. We have evidence from people who have died and have flatlined, no heartbeat, no brain activity, who were then later brought back in some other way or just came back and able to report things that they saw, things that they heard and witnessed elsewhere in the hospital or down the street or far removed from where their body was kept. What's to account for something like that? Maybe that the body is not the limit of the human person, and that maybe there's something else involved. We have, again, examples of miracles, people whose cancer went away without treatment, people who all over the world were cured of things like blindness or miraculously came through a horrible accident that should have taken their lives, or tumors that have disappeared. We have examples of this, and they're well documented. And here are some of the other ones: healing deafness, paralysis, people coming back to life, maybe after a near-death experience, etc. And then, of course, another evidence we have, and again, this is more controversial and deserves a whole other treatment another time, the Shroud of Turin. We've never been able to recreate this shroud, and there's so many special things involved in it and characteristics of it that would suggest that there's something miraculous involved in its production or its genesis that would give us reason to believe that maybe there's something more than just natural causes in our world. So, in addition to these evidential and philosophical arguments, we have popular consensus. Most people, at least in the 1995 survey, and that's kind of outdated, but believe in miracles. And only 6% of people at that time categorically denied them. Time in 1995 said that 2 out of 3 Americans affirm miracles. Newsweek in 2003, a little bit newer, says that 72% believe God can cure people. Pew Research, 79% miracles occur today. Business Wire, 73% of doctors believe in miracles can happen today. Wow, those are well-learned men and women with terminal degrees believing that miracles can take place. USA Today, 50% use prayer, and of these 91 believe it was effective, 51 highly effective. So there's a lot of popular consensus out there that there's something to this miracle business that would illustrate that perhaps naturalism, at least strict naturalism, is not the order of the day. So inasmuch as on philosophical grounds and in the face of NDEs and the pervasive examples of miracles, pure naturalism is unable to explain what is perceived or known. A theistic worldview is likely and therefore a more probable explanation for the resurrection of Jesus Christ. There's good reason to believe in a theistic worldview, and therefore there is room for the resurrection of Jesus Christ. So, now that we've made a case for the historicity of the resurrection, we've answered objections, and we've offered evidence or reasons to believe that we live in a world where something like a resurrection could take place. Let's connect the resurrection in particular and theism more generally to the person and work of Jesus, and finally arrive at a Christian worldview based on the resurrection. If Jesus really did defeat death, confirming his many predictions of such throughout his ministry, then there is good reason to believe his other teachings. If Jesus said that he was going to come back to life, and he did, then we ought to give more credence to other things that Jesus said. And if there are good reasons to believe what Jesus said, this would include what he says of himself. What did he say of himself? Well, in Matthew 26, 63 through 65, Jesus will say things like, and I quote, I can find it. When asked, I'll start in verse 63, the high priest stood up and said to him, "Do you not answer? What is it that these men are testifying against you?" But Jesus kept silent. And the high priest said to him, "I adjure you by the living God that you tell us whether you are the Christ, the Son of God." Jesus said to him, "You have said it yourselves. Nevertheless, I tell you, hereafter you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of power and coming on the clouds of heaven." Now, there's a lot there, but how do we know that this was a claim of divinity? Well, because in the next verse, the high priest tore his robes and says he has blasphemed. We may not or you may not understand what Jesus meant by that statement or that answer, but the Jews certainly did. They knew it was a claim of divinity, borrowing from a passage out of Daniel that incited rage among this high priest. What else did Jesus say? Well, he says things like, before Abraham was, I am, which is a very real statement of divinity and pre-existence. And then he says things like, I'm the way, the truth, and the life. No one can come into the Father except through me. These are important things and important claims that Jesus says that ought to be taken seriously, in part because of the resurrection. And if the resurrection, then Christianity's many major doctrines centered on Jesus Christ ought to be taken very, very seriously. So, we hope that this case for Christianity, the resurrection of Jesus Christ, has been beneficial. But again, what have we done? We've demonstrated the resurrection of Jesus as history, or given a case for it. We've answered objections to that case. And we've proposed a theistic worldview, that we live in a world in which something like a resurrection could occur, and have also articulated that if the resurrection did in fact take place, then the person and teaching of Jesus Christ ought to be taken seriously, giving us a good case for Christianity and the resurrection of Jesus Christ. If you have other questions about this, we invite you to share them or reach out to us. You can reach out to me at jrdickson, D-I-C-K-S-O-N, at liberty.edu. We'd love to answer any questions that you have and discuss anything further. I know this has been very quick and very brief, but we hope this is an encouragement to believers and also perhaps something to consider for unbelievers as they weigh their options and look at what Christians believe is the greatest miracle in the history of the world. Thank you so much.